Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Addiction, Cancer, Recovery, and Me podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Barbacci. And in today's episode, we are going to explore a question that comes up all the time. Can food actually help fight cancer? We are joined again by Adrian Cook, who takes us through his incredible journey from a lifestyle filled with sugar, alcohol, and processed food to a journey into raw veganism and later a more balanced paleo-style diet. Now, Adrian was diagnosed with cancer several years ago, and terminal cancer specifically, and the dietary decisions he made under nutritional guidance really impacted and made a positive change in his recovery. That's why we're so excited to share the lessons learned with you. And in this episode, we will be unpacking the reasoning behind each diet he approached or took on, what worked for him, what didn't, and the emotional and physical realities of making such drastic changes to his diet and lifestyle. Whether you're dealing with your own cancer journey or another healing journey, or simply want to understand how what we eat shapes how we heal, this is a very powerful conversation, and we hope you'll enjoy it and or learn from it. Thanks for joining us.
Adrian, hello.
Hi there.
Welcome back. How are you?
Very well. Yourself?
Yeah, you look well.
Thank you.
I know I tease you sometimes, but you do look very well. I mean, for a cancer patient.
Yeah.
No. Jokes aside. No, really good to have you back today. I'm actually really excited, hence my enthusiasm and whatnot, because today we're talking about my favorite topic, diet.
Fantastic.
And by diet, I don't mean the restriction of calories, short-term or long-term. By diet, I mean a long-term way of life of nurturing and providing your body with what it needs to thrive, not just survive. The information provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We are not medical professionals, although we have and will at times consult medical professionals. The content shared is based on our personal experience and research. This is Adrian's story from his perspective. With that in mind, there are a couple of things, as always, I want it to be a nice flowing conversation, but there are a couple of things that I think are really important to highlight off the bat to kind of set the scene for our audience. Obviously, we have touched upon diet in various other episodes that we have recorded so far, one being in the most recent one we recorded on cancer, and obviously how diet plays a very important part in both the journey leading up to a cancer diagnosis, and therefore the potential underlying causes of cancer potentially, as well as how one nurtures or nourishes the body during or throughout a cancer treatment, and then afterwards, right? If one is fortunate enough to survive a diagnosis like yours, then how one continues to proceed on that journey of making sure your body has what it needs to stay healthy and stay disease non-evident in your case. So with that being said, I think I did read off the stat in the last episode, but just in case some of our audience won't have seen it, so just love to reiterate it again, or repeat it rather. So the World Cancer Research Fund states that obviously one of the most significant challenges of our generation is preventing cancer, because it is growing in almost every country, the rate of cancer incidence. And so it's a significant public health challenge. And specifically, they estimate that around 40% of cancer cases could be prevented by tackling risk factors relating to diet, nutrition, and physical activity. So those are three really important areas that are often overlooked by all members of society, by a lot of us in society, and yet they are three areas that you have taken really seriously along your cancer journey. And so for the purposes of setting the scene, I'd love to, and with that set in mind, I'd love for you to talk me through what you have really focused on in terms of those three areas, diet, nutrition, and physical activity, and what steps you took both at the onset of your journey and sort of the midst of the journey, and then still today, what you do, what's part of your routine, and what do you really, what you focus on to stay healthy.
Okay, so
that's a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say, where do I start?
Wherever you wish.
Okay, well, I guess a key area, a key point, which I know we've touched on, again, as you rightly say, it needs elaborating on further, was during the kind of initial discussions around the trial, what the trial, what I'm likely to encounter during the trial, what the drug does, from the pros and cons of the drug that might be, and and how I can basically prepare myself or use the right kind of additives. Additive isn't the right word.
Supplements elements in your diet, right?
Exactly, elements.
Let's just say elements.
Elements will do. Yeah. So the right elements that I can kind of put within my system to help, whether it be make the treatment work better, but most importantly, was to support my system and help eliminate what could be possible side effects, which there's quite a few. I mean, I've given a book this pretty much thick, talking about all the side effects and the risks, which are predominantly sort of gut and immune system. There's a quite a negative effect that the drug can have in those areas. So right off the bat, I proactively thought, well, okay, well, how can what am I best to do to prepare myself for what I'm going in for?
Right.
And as I say, so that starts with the gut and immune support. So I did, a bit of digging into immune support, what makes the gut work, what best supports the gut. And it's quite interesting actually, because there's a book called 10% Human. I can't remember the author. Maybe we'll bring that up another time, but it's quite interesting where we talk about, or rather the book talks more about bacteria. When it refers to 10% human, it's kind of getting the point across that we are pretty much bacteria. And that's
a scary thought.
It is, isn't it? When you really when you think about it, yeah. It's but within the gut, there's healthy bacteria, which basically support the gut and allow your system to work as it should do. And in turn, that helps to support the immune system. So as I say, I started to investigate in what substances or supplements or diet, aspects of the diet could be improved on to help support that system, or that immune system, as well as the gut microbes, which are the bacteria that I was just talking about. So, I investigated what prebiotics and what probiotics do, but again, both support good gut health, certain foods and whatnot that again help boost the system and strengthen the system. Because, as I say, with immunotherapy, certainly with the trial drug, it has a real strong detrimental effect on gut and immune support.
Right.
And of course, that is a knock-on effect, because of course, if your immune system is low and your gut health is poor, then that can also mean you're more susceptible to disease and illness. So, and again, it's kind of a vicious circle, really, as if you're putting a drug into your system that destroys your immune, or has a detrimental effect on your immune system and gut health, which in turn can then make the illness that you're trying to fight even more prevalent, or give it the opportunity to come back or to grow stronger. So there's that kind of that ongoing battle there. So as I say, I thought, well, I just think a little bit outside the box of what can I do. So that's where I started looking into, as I say, supplements and diet, and started to introduce different food groups in, because my diet at that time was poor. And when I say poor, I was not conscious of what I was eating as such. Lots of packet food. I was using the microwave pretty much for everything, whether not just reheating food, cooking food in plastics. Wow. All sorts. Processed foods.
A lot of ultra-processed foods, I was going to say.
A lot of ultra-processed food.
Which is very common these days, right? It's actually quite hard to I mean, it's not hard, but it is quite common to find ultra-processed foods in the average supermarket, right? Yeah. In fact, over fresh produce, because fresh produce is, in theory, harder to maintain and keep fresh. So there's a lot of packaged and ultra-processed foods thereby.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. So, and I was, I think, it's the educational process. It's not particularly common knowledge. There's a lot more today. Funny enough, over the last 2 to 3 years, this stuff has really snowballed. I think it's pretty much everywhere across social media about how to support the gut. About organic foods, et cetera, et cetera. So it's much easier to access this knowledge now than what it used to be when I was first starting. Even going back sort of 5 years plus, it wasn't as prevalent. It wasn't on everyone's kind of mindset. Now you have a conversation. Most people, they'll understand. About the benefits of not having processed foods.
I think it also depends on where you grew up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the environment that you're in.
I think certain areas are particularly good at. I mean, certainly, I think it comes with a certain level of affluence too. Funny enough, the areas that are most affluent can sometimes have the worst food because they are the ones that can afford all of these prepackaged meals, etc. Whereas poor people can't.
Exactly.
It depends. But then again, there's the argument that a lot of the canned foods show up where poverty is. And so people who are poor eat a lot of canned foods. So there's kind of, it is a difficult scenario because one aspect of this is affordability, right?
Yeah.
So organic is deemed expensive. When is it really that organic is expensive,
is it
or is it
really?
just that the other stuff is that cheap?
I think that's the key
and that
point.
actually you need less food when it's good quality food, when it's organic. You actually consume less because your body is nourished. So it's an interesting, and we can get into that more in depth later because we'll go into
of course,
the benefits of organic produce. But it is certainly an increasing phenomenon whereby the supermarkets have less and less fresh produce and more packaged and ultra-processed foods. So regardless of where you are, whether it's in an affluent or poorer neighborhood.
Exactly. Well, so as I say, I did my own kind of due diligence on all of that, and I pretty much set myself a program, like a dietary program of where I started to research the supplements, which obviously we'll come on to, but from the dietary to food aspect, well, kind of as we've touched on, but haven't really elaborated on, is my brother-in-law, bless him. Kind of he was a strict vegan, and at the time, as I say, my knowledge was pretty poor. I hadn't really investigated too much at that stage, although I was starting to. So I was taking it off for obvious reasons. But he, kindly pointed out to me, the pros and cons of certain food groups when it comes to cancer and the benefits of certain things. Now, bearing in mind he's strict vegan, so
and has he been vegan for a long time?
Yeah, he'd
long
probably
term.
I think probably for a good 4 to 5 years.
Okay.
Prior
to you,
prior, absolutely.
Going on 10 years, if not
there you
more
go.
now.
Yeah, exactly. So I listened to him, and he was talking to me about the pros and cons of certain food groups, what sugars can do, what kind of raw meats or red meats can do. And in fact, he's being a vegan, he was obviously completely anti-meat, to be fair.
Right, sure.
And I kind of I embrace that. And I kind of, as I say, with the knowledge that I kind of had at that stage, I kind of put all of my kind of trust into my brother-in-law, because he had a lot more
knowledge,
and
he had really read about it and studied it and learned it. It wasn't just a fad for him; it was a way of life based on his reading and studying and learning of this.
Absolutely. But so we talked about fiber, the benefits of fiber, obviously proteins, and good, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and he basically put me on a dietary program. Nice. Now, it was quite a dramatic change of events for me, because I went from a high sugar diet, high processed diet, hardly any fruit really. I wasn't exercising at the time either, so my system was probably shot to bits. So I knew that I wasn't prepared for what I was about or just beginning to go through. So to reiterate the point, that I put my faith in him, because
it was a revolutionary change for you.
I knew nothing. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it did. And it was a big shock to the system. It took me I had a sugar withdrawal.
Interesting.
Which
and
was
how did
quite
that exhibit?
interesting.
In what form?
Like cramps, nausea, headaches, shakes. It's crazy. It's
wow.
honestly power of
Yeah.
the addiction, you know,
Yeah.
within sugar.
And I was going to say, mentioning addiction, you at this point were sober, right? So
Yeah,
it
well,
wasn't
yeah.
even like a withdrawal from sugar of alcohol. It was a withdrawal from sugar,
Absolutely,
period.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
you had
yeah.
already gotten rid of the
Yeah,
alcohol.
absolutely, yeah. And
years
as I say, I
prior.
was having quite a lot of sugar. I mean, again, I just took everything for granted. My wife, bless her, I would, it was at my request, I should say, you know, she'd go and buy me 2 cakes from the baker's in the morning.
Right,
And that was
wow.
my breakfast,
Wow.
you know.
Yeah.
And then addict mind coming into play, I guess, that become the norm. And I was craving that every morning.
Yeah.
And that was my start of the day, which
Yeah.
is probably
During your
one of
initial
the
cancer
worst
treatment,
things you
right?
could be doing. Yeah.
During your initial cancer.
Yeah, exactly. During the cancer treatment,
Yeah.
prior to this trial.
Yeah.
So as I say, it's a real kind of
Revolutionary change.
Yeah. And so, you know, we was looking at research, because looking at obviously plant-based diet, pulses and beans, which I ended up having a lot of. He gave me some recipes for certain soups, lentil soups and chickpeas and all of this stuff, so to get away from the meat, because he was adamant to get away from that.
Right.
That's his perspective,
Yeah.
and that which became my perspective.
Right.
Hands up. I took his lead and I followed that path for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think that had a very, very poignant part to play with my recovery, because I think shocking the system, changing the dynamics within, almost like a keto type of thing, where your body kind of goes into sort of almost like shock mode. And I think that had a real positive part to play within, you know, how I was responding to treatment. It took a little while.
Yeah.
I mean, I went from, over the course of 3 months, I probably went from 13 stone to 9, because I'd cut all the rubbish out. I'd cut out obviously the sugar, as I say, and I was purely on this vegan strict, and we're talking raw vegan, because you still get processed. You know, you go to the supermarket and you go to the vegan aisle, and the packets that are there are no different. They're just as processed as what the the other stuff is. So it's just kind of some food for thought there, no pun intended. But
it's a really interesting point. The reason I just want to pause there for a second is because actually you mentioned earlier that it was a shock to your system going from high processed foods. You were eating meat, copious amounts of all sorts of things that you don't now. And so it was a shock to your system.
Wasn't, for a while.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't for a while, right? Once you switched to veganism. But there's this really interesting, I have it out today, not because I'm trying to promote the book, but because I've been reading this throughout our journey of reading about cancer, et cetera, that the China study, which came out in 2006, I think it was, and so a while ago now, but it's based on 35 years plus of research that a doctor by the name of Tim Colin Campbell compiled. He started off as a veterinarian. I think he studied at Cornell University. Well, first he did his undergrad, and then he went to Cornell to do his PhD, I believe. Anyway, so he's a doctor in and of himself, and he studied medicine and then went to do research and ended up doing research for the U.S. I think it's through the NIH and other organizations. Forgive me if his bio is not spot on. It's all in the book, however. But he's, a well-established researcher, and ultimately wrote the book, I believe, towards the end of his career or at the end of his career. And it's funny, he started off coming from his father was a farmer and had, I believe, cattle on his ranch or farm, and was very much, consumed a lot of meat, but his father died pretty young. And it kind of compelled him to, or propelled his further studies and research. And what I'm trying to say is he started off actually as a meat lover and very much a proponent of meat, particularly back in the 70s. There was this idea that the gap in nutrition in lower income countries actually stemmed from a lack of sufficient protein. So they called it the protein gap. And they had this idea that if they could increase the amount of protein in those countries, underdeveloped or low-income countries, that they could essentially resolve the nutrition issue. So then he was essentially paid to do some studying in in Asia, and I think he started off in the Philippines specifically, and they studied peanuts, but then they realized that peanuts had this really severe toxic mold that was very, very dangerous. And so anyways, they started studying this protein gap and doing various research on various high protein foods. And one was looking at meat and one was looking at peanuts, and he did all sorts of studies over the course of 35 years. But basically what it concluded is actually that non-animal based foods were ultimately much better for people with cancer. And the reason being that they noticed, now I have to get this right, but through their studies, and again, he started off as a meat lover and a proponent of meat and animal-based products. He actually realized through his 35 years of studies that if a person has 20% or more, above 15% actually, but 20% specifically was, I think, a number, of animal-based protein in their diet, it would turn cancer on. And if they had 5% or lower, it would turn cancer off. It was literally the switch. So those percentages were really key. And it's not, he didn't start off as a proponent of veganism, but he eventually became a vegan through his research because he realized how powerful this research was. And they did multiple studies too. He started off as a skeptic, almost not believing his own findings. Like, this can't be possible. How could this be? I can't go around telling people the meat industry will not like that. But, and then he talks about the corruption within the food industry, something again we'll go on to, but I am raising it because you mentioned that it had this shock on your system, and it's not just a shock because it was a change, but it literally was the catalyst between I believe, based on what this book is saying, that it could have been the catalyst between turning the cancer on and off, because you went from being, to having a very processed diet to suddenly having a vegan diet, very strict, but essentially would have gone below that 5% threshold and effectively turned it off so that you would have seen a decrease in eventually where you are now. I don't know. It seems like that could be a compelling thought. So I wanted to raise that because I just found that fascinating, frankly.
I mean, I'm with you on that. And it's a very interesting study, but I mean, as I've kind of gone through this journey, and as I say, I was strict vegan for 2.5, 3 years.
I think you said 4 originally.
Is it 4?
4?
Maybe 4. Yeah, actually, no, tell a lie. Yeah, you're right. It is.
I think you said about 4 years.
Time flies when you're having fun. And I'm not anymore. And the reason what came about there was there's sound argument for what this book is getting across, and some proven studies there. But there is a flip side to that, I believe, which I've, through my own further investigations and through other people that I've talked to. And how this came about was, during the trial, everything was going absolutely swimmingly for 2 to 3 years. And then...
This is the 4th trial.
Yeah, this is where we are today. So the trial that I'm still under the umbrella of, I'm still part of still under the wing, if you like, of the trial team, but I'm no longer on treatment. So... but during kind of towards the end of the treatment, I should say, so the last, going back, a year, where are we? So I've been off treatment now for a year and 3-4 months, something like that. So prior to that, there was some signs in my blood that, what they put it down to is what could be a leaky gut. Now, as I've already kind of touched on, that I was hardly having any kind of I wasn't symptomatic whatsoever with regards to what were considered to be the side effects of this, of the immunotherapy drug, the damage to the gut, the damage to the immune system. Now, everything within me, all my blood work, everything was coming back as absolutely normal. As I said, every now and again I get some gripes in my stomach, which they did put that down to the drug, but because it used to wear off over the course of a couple of weeks, and then when I'm just going back into treatment again, it would come up. But it was very kind of intermittent. It was nothing for me to really worry about. In fact, it's quite funny, but it was a little bit kind of strange at times, because I could almost set my clock by it. I would know it. If I was hungry at certain times, the kind of pains in the gut would come on, but it would last 10 seconds. Literally that. It would go, and then that would be it. And I'd probably get that That's about 2 to 3 days a week. First of all, they started to look into that, but they kept challenging, kind of. Well, not so much challenging, but I guess they was questioning me constantly. What is your diet? What you're having this, you having blah blah blah. And I said, well, look, I feel, apart from the obvious, apart from the small gripes that I get, I feel great. And then bearing in mind at this time I was exercising regularly, but I was at that point still on the vegan diet. I was eating healthily. Certainly a damn sight better than what I was. But they said, well, look, he said the gripes. He said, and some of your blood work is showing that there may well be a leak in the gut. And as I say, I felt absolutely fine. So I was they wanted to send me for endoscopy and whatnot, which is where they put a camera inside you.
The endoscopy, right?
Endoscopy, yep. and there's another one where they're going the other way. But anyway, I'm not going into too much detail there.
Fine.
Excuse me. And they did constant blood work. They kept checking and to find it, and they could, even when the endoscopy, etc. results came back, everything was absolutely normal. They did found some polyps there, but that's not related. Just so happened to show up. So they removed those. Which I'll be honest with you, I wasn't particularly happy about because they never told me at the time, but they just went ahead and did it. But hey, that's done now. But yeah, so at that point, they wanted to investigate the blood work even further, and they said, "But we're going to stop the trial stop this treatment for this month." So at this point, I was having treatment still every.
And you were clear of the tumors at this point, right?
Yeah,
they were still doing the treatment.
Yeah, still on the treatment.
So how quickly into the 4-year, well now 5-year 4-year treatment? Sorry, it was 4 years of treatment, and now you've been a year and a half since.
That's
almost.
Correct.
But the treatment stopped around the 4-year mark.
That's
that right?
Yeah.
So how far into the 4-year treatment were your tumors gone? Did your tumors disappear?
Well, they started to deplete after 3 to 4 months.
Right.
So quite quickly.
Yeah.
And then
they shrunk, but they weren't
shrunk.
gone.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they sort of continued to shrink. And I do believe it was probably about 18 months to 2 years.
Okay.
When I finally basically told me that there was no signs of disease. So non-disease evident.
Disease non-evident. Yeah. Exactly.
So disease is non-evident. So all of this time, there was nothing showing on scans, etc. But as I say, they still had this niggle. They still wanted to get to the bottom of why this blood work was slightly off.
Right.
Which I'm going to be honest, I wasn't particularly happy about because proofs, pun intended, proofs in the eating. But I felt great.
So what was it about the blood work that was off? What specifically?
Well, there was something, I think it was a protein or something that was slightly up or elevated, which, again, was showing symptoms that there was a leaky gut, which is why they wanted to do the endoscopy, to go in and see if they could see anything from there. And as I say, that will come back fine. So
was a leaky gut is the leaky gut one of the potential side effects of the drug, or is it just something else?
A leaky gut, basically a leaky gut can come about via, which we get like a perforation in the lining. But
something has to have something acidic usually has to has to have eaten through that, right?
This is bearing in mind
it's bacteria normally that causes. Is it kind of like an ulcer? What do you mean by leaky gut? Is that like an ulcer?
Well,
in the stomach?
it's literally what it is. It means where the gut starts to leak fluid from out through the walls.
Yeah.
No.
I guess what I'm trying to say is the cause of the leak of the hole.
Yeah.
The perforation is a hole, right? So the cause of the hole.
They didn't know.
Sometimes can be, for example, bacteria, because your stomach. The reason I'm asking this question is I know, for example, when you have an ulcer, it's because the stomach acids in your, let me get this right, you don't have enough of the good bacteria to kill off the bad bacteria, I believe. So the bad bacteria ultimately eats through your stomach lining, which is. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that's something similar.
Yeah,
but they don't know.
Possibly. I'm going to be honest. Okay. I'm not.
They didn't explain it. They didn't.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, and once again, I think it's just to reiterate the fact that I'm no expert on this. I know what.
Sure.
I've followed, the information that was in front of me.
Yeah.
The little bit of the investigation that I did to understand more. But of course, there's a lot of grey area. I'm no medical expert, so to speak. So when they were talking about this, it was kind of double Dutch to me.
Didn't know. Yeah.
All I knew.
Wasn't sure if they found out what it was at the end.
But what was most important to me is the fact that I felt as best as I felt. Forget the cancer. I'm going back, pre-addiction, back into my teens and early 20s. I felt healthier at that stage than I ever had done.
Okay.
And bearing in mind that half of the other, or majority of, I should say, the other patients on the trial were really suffering.
Yeah.
And
really,
they'd either stopped treatment or
Side
they were
effects
really
were
going through the side effects. They were having to miss multiple treatments because of the side effects.
Yeah.
I wasn't having any of that. As I said, touched on just a few gripes every now and again. But these guys were adamant that something was going on and we've got to stop treatment now until we get to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
And
so I was wondering if leaky gut was a symptom that any of the other patients were experiencing,
well,
if it was another...
it was never raised.
Yeah.
that's just what
that's just what they told you.
That's just
It
what they
could be a
told me.
problem.
Yeah,
Okay.
it could be a problem. But as I say, what was frustrating me was the fact that I felt great. I was having no other symptoms. There's no blood in, if you know what I mean, in certain areas and all that kind of thing. So there was no real telltale signs of anything, apart from one thing which they never really acknowledged, to be fair, and that's fibre. Now, bearing in mind, I'm on an incredibly high fibre diet.
Yeah.
Which, fibre obviously is essential.
Yeah.
And for good gut health, we need fibre, but
to be able to break down the protein and all that.
Yeah, exactly. But too much of a good thing can be a bad thing.
Yes.
As that goes across the board, across most things, to be fair.
Yeah.
But so at that time, obviously, I was heavily invested in the vegan diet, raw vegan, lots of fibre, tens of grams of fibre per day. And I did the math, and I thought, okay, maybe I need to investigate the fibre thing.
Yeah. And
that's where my diet changed. Not overnight, but I had...
Again, for the second time, like for the, significant change.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is where I thought I would seek, some alternative advice. And being part of the Buddhist order, I reached out to a couple of people, and I was put in touch with one of the heads of the order who's based over in LA.
Okay.
And in fact, she's married to the head of the Buddhist order over in the UK.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And she's a very influential woman. And she's also a dietitian.
Oh, wow.
And so basically I went to another student's temple, a good friend of mine, bless her. And we had this interview with her. And it was about 3 hours interview, talking about diet, talking about, journey today, blah, 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 etc., etc. And as I said, being a Buddhist, I was quite taken back with what she was suggesting. So she basically turned around to me and said, plants for you now are the enemy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a complete and utter contrast.
Well, I guess because you'd had too much.
Because I've had too much.
Yeah, yeah.
She said you've had far too much. So she wanted to put me onto a paleo-keto diet.
Interesting. Okay.
And everything. Bearing in mind, I hadn't touched meat. I hadn't sniffed,
in 4 years.
In 4 years.
Yeah.
So it was a massive, I nearly fell over, and I thought, well, I don't quite know if this sits well. All of the research, everything that I'd investigated and whatnot that I'd done is, this is going completely against the grain.
Okay.
Again, no pun intended. So, she was saying, well, butter in coffee, steak mince, fry that up into, and just tell him, cook it, everything in butter, lard. And I thought, this is just doesn't resonate with me. So anyhow, I looked into it and I spoke to a couple of other people, and I was told the story from the other side of the fence.
Okay.
The benefits of having organics, meats.
Well, I think there's a big difference between just going back to meat and going back to high quality meat.
Exactly.
So that's an important distinction we have to make too, because There's a significant difference. And
101%. Yeah.
People like to do sort of all or nothing. And it's like, well, actually, you have to be careful what your source is, because that determines 100%. The quality too. Yeah.
And to be fair, that's what she told me. She said,
sure.
Stay away from supermarkets.
Yeah.
Do not get any produce from there, or your eggs, or everything else that I want you to take, your butters. From the farm. Of all original, produce, from an organic source. It has, grass-fed beef, etc., etc. I still struggle to this day with the beef side of things.
Yeah.
But I spoke to her and said, well, what about fish? Because I used to be pescatarian anyway, years back.
Sure.
And she said, okay, well, oily fish is good. It's great. So if you're struggling with the meat, she said, I really would like you to do that. But if we need to change the gut microbes. She said, we need to get away from the fibre for a while.
Okay.
She said, I want you to cut the vegetables out completely, which is what I did. And I did that for about best part of 6 months.
Okay.
And
so it's really just a counterbalance
exactly.
or counteract or balance out.
Counterbalance. Yeah, exactly.
The excess fiber. So it wasn't so much the vegan diet, it was that you had maybe taken it to excess. You hadn't balanced 100%. Your vegan diet properly.
No, 100%.
I want to stress that, because it's not that, actually the vegan diet undermined me over time. It was actually, if you got to be careful how you do it. It's like when people say I'm a vegetarian, but they eat bread and cheese, right? Like that. No, I'm sorry, that's not a vegetarian diet, and it's also not a healthy diet.
No, exactly.
So that you have to do it right.
You
have to,
100%.
You need to understand what you're doing too.
Exactly.
So it sounds like you just did too much of fiber, but you didn't balance out maybe with enough pulses or other things that have high protein in them. So then you needed to balance.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I was having, because my wife, bless her, she used to make me this mix up, which was had wild rice in there, loads of pulses, different pulses, kidney beans, you name it, all different sorts of pulses. What else was in there? Some broccoli, loads of garlic, olive oil. And the olive oil wasn't cooked with; it was put in afterwards. As you shouldn't really cook with olive oil.
Olive oil, right?
Maybe something can come on to. But so and I pretty much, because it had everything within this pot,
right,
that I associated as being what I needed.
Okay.
I had that religiously for 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And then
it sounds like it wasn't quite balanced.
No, it wasn't really.
Yeah.
But as I say,
it worked. It worked for a while at least. It kept you.
I think that again, this isn't proven, and this is, as we talk, everything is from my perspective here.
Yeah, I should correct myself. Sorry, it's not that it wasn't balanced. It could just also be that when you eat the same thing over and over and over again, your body needs a change, because it gets too used to things and adapts to it. So you do need a change. You can't eat the same meal. My partner does this. If it were up to him, he'd eat nothing but hummus, cheese, olives, sausages, and tomatoes for the rest of his life every day. And I say you need to vary the diet, because your body needs
to bring more, a little bit more
different vitamins, different minerals.
At the end of the day, it's about balance. It's all about balance.
Yeah. So you needed to switch it up. So you went to this
so I went on
paleo-keto diet.
Yeah. So well, I didn't embrace it completely, as I say, because I still struggled. It wasn't so much the thought of eating, because I mean, when I was kind of going back to the very early days, pre-cancer, etc. I mean, I would have steak tartare and whatnot. Rack of lamb was my favourite thing.
Right.
But as when I became more spiritual, and really took on and the Buddhist way, so kind of this suffering element, which is obviously Buddhism. The key thing with Buddhism is to eliminate suffering. It's the thought of what happens with that. Yeah, especially with not mainstream farming, not organic farming, etc. The way battery farming with it's horrendous.
Right.
And that really did not sit well with me. And the thought of again, it's just my personal perspective. The thought of having lamb or, another sentinel being, if you like,
and a baby sheep.
Yeah, exactly. Just did not sit well with me, and I still struggle with that to this day. But that again, that's my personal perspective. It's the cruelty aspect of it that I struggle with.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be honest, put my cards on the table. There's my naivety, I guess, a bit, is the fact I thought it was a Buddhist way was to stay away from that, but it's not at all. Far from it, to be exact. But as long as the animal doesn't suffer, and there's certain mantras that you can share, that you can have before you actually eat the food, to bless the food, and to give kind of power to the animal that's passed.
Yeah.
So to ease their passing, or to ease, to if you're a believer.
Well, you're talking to a 20-year vegetarian, so I am a believer, and yes, I completely understand. And it's interesting, actually. We can go into it perhaps another time, but there, the conversation of halal versus kosher and all this. It's very interesting to me how these things come about. But maybe we'll have another discussion on that, because I certainly, one of the main reasons I became a vegetarian. And again, like I said, up until recently, so just over 20 years, I think it was. I'm still not fully off. I plan to go back, but there's a specific reason why I've made some exceptions this year. Anyway, for me, it was the suffering of the animals. And I actually witnessed my father, actually, he'd already killed it by the time I came out there, but he had hunted a 10-point deer in our backyard, and he had me lug it into the barn on our property, and then had me hold the legs while he hacked it in half, and the blood went spurting everywhere. And that was a very traumatic incident for me. I was an adult. I was 21, 22 probably at the time, but it was just very clear to me. I said, wow, this is definitely, the animal was dead at that point, but I couldn't help but think, like, this is Bambi's father. And I know that sounds ridiculous to a lot of people, but to me it really was like, wow, this was a beautiful 10-point deer, meaning like 5 antler, massive beauty. And bless him, my father, being a very talented hunter, had managed to catch him, and it was very traumatic for me. So that set me on the path for 20 years. I was very adamant, and the more that I learned about how meat is raised in the U.S., and it's mostly farmed, industrial farming, and it's horrific, and it's bad for the animals, it's bad for humans, it's filled with all sorts of hormones. And then it's just poisonous. It's really not actually good for you. So I do sometimes question to what extent this study is based on plant-based diet versus non-organic meat, or plant-based diet versus organic meat, because I think that makes a huge difference, right? And I'd have to delve a bit more into that, and I do appreciate you countering with that, because there is a very good argument for, if you have good quality meat, it's much better than bad quality meat.
Exactly. And
regardless of where you're. And
as I say, I think I was kind of forced into that transition because of the overuse of fibre. Yeah. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, from a personal perspective, which I guess is kind of common sense in one way, is the fact that it's about balance. Yes. And finding that balance of good, healthy foods,
well sourced,
all organics, well exactly, whether it be animal, vegetable, mineral, whatever it might be, to make sure it's organic, it's from the right source, it's got what it says on the tin. Exactly. And then you're halfway there. Yeah. That's in layman's terms, in a nutshell, that's kind of where I am, and that's kind of my philosophy on it all.
Well, and that's the basis of the Mediterranean diet, for example, right? So the Mediterranean diet, long known for being a very healthy diet that leads to long lives, right? Everybody in the Mediterranean who follows that kind of diet. It's rich in fruits and vegetables and whole grains, but also fish and healthy fats and sometimes and some degree of meat. So it's not a vegan, plant-based diet, but it is a very well-known healthy diet, because it's based predominantly on very good produce that isn't processed. So you can make dishes out of strong ingredients, but if they're ultimately processed ingredients, then it doesn't really matter if they're organic anymore. They're processed, Exactly. It doesn't matter if they start off organic. If they end up being ultra processed and added to in many ways, then it's not so good for you anymore. So it's ultimately a diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and et cetera, but is farmed organically and is raised on good, rich soil that is that has biodiversity. For example.
Absolutely, yeah.
Biodiversity being the key.
Yeah, exactly. And now, I've read something only yesterday, funny enough, about soil depletion. About where soil is being overfarmed.
The mass farming has led to soil depletion.
It loses its integrity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, that's where organic farming
nutrients.
is so, exactly.
It loses the integrity and therefore its nutrients, and therefore the fruit. Yeah, they say that the food that we grow these days has 5% of the nutritional value that it originally did. 5%.
Yeah, exactly.
So you need to eat, how many more apples and oranges to get the same nutrition of?
Yeah. And I mean, again, you talk about apples. I mean, here's an argument for and against, the supermarket against the farm shop, the organic, non-organic, etc.
Yes.
Now, I couldn't get to my farm shop one day.
Okay.
So I tell a lie, I could get there, but it wasn't open.
Okay.
So I couldn't get in there.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get some apples. So what did I do? Convenience. The next step was to go just to the local supermarket, which is what I did. I bought apples, brought them home. I have this habit of I have half an apple and I will share half the apple with the blackbirds in the garden.
Love it. That's
and
nice.
And they have a wonderful time.
Oh.
But this time I did exactly the same thing. Threw the apple out, didn't think anything else of it. And anyhow, my temple's at the end of the garden, which I go to sort of every evening. I went out there that evening. Now, bearing in mind, them blackbirds are there all day, generally, and as soon as I get them out, they're almost sitting there waiting. They know the routine.
Oh.
And I went and I just happened to notice the apple as I walked, and it just hadn't been touched.
They'd scoffed at your half
No,
apple from the supermarket.
Yeah, they scoffed. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And what does that say?
That they could tell the difference between organic and not.
They knew the difference.
And they knew the difference that there was something wrong with that organic, that non-organic apple from the supermarket. Yeah.
So I guess so. To kind of encompass everything, I think what I'm trying to get across here is that a good balance of healthy, organic, natural, non-processed, non-sugar full produce.
Yes.
Is where I wanted to be and which is where I am today.
Yes.
But bearing in mind, I think it's important to note this, is that when I changed my diet, I was at that stage non-disease evident.
Right.
So I wasn't, battling the cancer cells within. It may well have been a completely different story if I'd have been in the same situation at that time. But bearing in mind, I had done a lot of work at this point.
4 years.
The exercise, the diet, the complete change of routine, complete change of lifestyle,
meditation,
the Reiki, all the spiritual side, the energy work.
Yes.
And all of those things combined, which is obviously why we're here today.
Yes.
Sharing all of this stuff.
Yes.
It's that whole complete package.
Yes.
I believe, is what has got me to where I am today.
Yes.
So, there's an argument for veganism. There's those that are pure advocates for the paleo-keto or the meat diet. But personally, I feel it's
finding the right balance.
It's finding that balance.
I think the crux of I think the message or the main takeaway is that while diet alone is not a cure for cancer, studies and strong evidence suggests and shows that certain dietary patterns and foods and nutrients can play a really important role, a significant role in cancer prevention, in supporting the treatment, supporting one's digestive system and stomach, etc., during treatment, and also the recovery.
Yeah.
So I think
exactly
that's essentially the message we're trying to get across here. And I think it's a really important one because people... Again, back to that period where in the first stages of the first round of cancer, melanoma, and then the first 3 drug trials of the second round of cancer, you had complete faith in the medical profession. And not to say that one shouldn't have any faith in the medical profession, but you need to also do your part to complement what they're doing. Because your cure, your digression, the reduction and shrinkage of your tumors did not occur despite all the drug trials until that point when you changed your diet and
exactly.
nutrition.
That's definitely worth underlining.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the key point.
That is the key part.
Is the fact that, do the math.
Yeah.
The cancer, I went through 3 different bouts.
Yeah.
Of immunotherapy treatment.
Yeah, and chemotherapy.
And none of it worked.
And chemotherapy. None of it worked. In fact, it grew.
Well, it was immunotherapy. Yeah.
Yes.
Because chemo doesn't work.
No, the chemo tablets in the beginning.
Chemo tablets, of course.
Yeah, you did have the chemo tablets.
Not an infusion.
Yes,
that's
sorry.
Chemo, that's right, yes. Yeah, that's a kind of standard course.
Right.
Standard procedure, they start
yes, not,
you're right, though, but you're right to raise that because, there was certainly a chemo element to it. But, as I say, just to recap, nothing worked.
Right.
Nothing was working. you know,
until
I laid the foundations.
Right.
And I think that's critical.
Yeah.
So, and again, just purely for what worked for me.
Right.
And, you know, hence why we're here today, is build that foundation, go back to basics, reset the clock.
Yes.
Work on the immune system.
Whole foods.
Work whole foods.
Non-processed foods.
Yeah. You know,
eliminate the sugar.
put the good stuff in.
Yeah.
Cut the rubbish
eliminate the
out.
sugar and the rubbish completely.
Yeah,
not just
exactly.
reduce it
and
completely.
you will go, your body will go into shock.
Yeah.
Right? But I've personally,
but it's worth.
is research to show that there's a positive attribute with that.
Yeah.
Your body's like, bang, whoa,
Yeah.
hang on a minute, what's happening
It'll
here?
actually have to adapt
And it resets,
and change.
yeah, exactly.
And in fact, isn't that sort of the basis of the keto diet is that it goes into ketosis, so it actually eats all the negative dead cells.
That
then actually helps cure from all sorts of diseases,
that's the benefit.
eczema
That's what fasting does as well,
dementia, all sorts of things, because your body's eating away at the bad cells,
Absolutely.
dead cells.
Exactly.
So yeah. Okay, so we have a few minutes left, and I want to touch upon some specifics and give some practical recommendations about diet. So there are some specific food groups. Again, not everybody, a lot of people hear the word diet and they think, oh, I have to go on this like short-term 3 months, 6 months diet just to lose some weight. That's not what we're talking about here.
No.
Again, I really want to reiterate that.
Absolutely.
With us, it's about change. It's about a new way of life and finding a sustainable diet, a sustainable meal plan that you can continue to follow throughout your life, because you're not just restricting all those things you love. You're ultimately finding a passion and changing your palate. So I want to get onto that, because I know you've touched upon that before. That's a really key point, that when you eliminate the excessive amounts of sugar or sugar altogether, you actually discover all of a sudden that those foods that you thought were bland before actually taste like something, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so let's talk about some of those food groups that are so important, like cruciferous vegetables and antioxidant-rich foods and omega-3 fatty acids and, curcumin, turmeric that you take in copious amounts, and then the dietary fiber, which in excess is not good, but in the right amount, balanced amount, is important and essential. So can you talk me through, what does your diet look like today? So you've gone through a vegan diet for 4 years and now a paleo-keto diet, and then what do you eat now?
Right, well...
Or how do you stay disease non-evident?
Okay, well, bearing in mind also there's a two-pronged approach with me, because because I've got to where I am today, my body is a temple. Right. I think
all of
a bit
our
of a
bodies
cliche,
but
they should be.
They should be treated as such. Our bodies are our temples. If we don't treat it right, it won't sustain us.
No, that's
simple
100%.
as that.
But bearing in mind, so I've gone from being this couch potato eating rubbish on a daily basis to someone that has a strict, high protein diet, and a lot of exercise. And as I say, there's a two-pronged approach, because I'm exercise. I know we're discussing diet today, and we're coming on to exercise, I know that, because that's paramount.
Right.
Oxygen in the blood, it's been proven that cancer cells struggle to survive in a truly oxygenated system. Right. And so that's something I work on daily. We're here today, so I'm not at the gym. So I'm generally at the gym for 3 to 5 days a week. Yeah. Religiously. Yeah, and for 2 hours.
I was going to say,
session.
For a long period of time, not just 30-minute cardio. You're there for 2 hours. In fact, often doing
a lot of weight, hell of a lot of weight training.
Yeah, weight training.
So the food groups, or the food that I'm putting into my system is to benefit. Obviously the exercise. I have quite a quick metabolism, so I have to put the fuel within there to train. Otherwise, I would lose weight quite quickly.
Yeah. Well, you probably have a high metabolism now. You might not have,
true.
Because you exercise a lot
because
and your body's healthy.
Yeah. But I always did. That's one thing I had growing up.
Oh, okay.
I was 9.5 stone from the age of about 16 till I was 23.
Okay.
And it didn't matter what I really put in my system at that stage. As kids normally,
well,
let's be honest.
Normal between 9 and 23.
Yeah,
it's in the late 20s and 30s that you start to see the weight gain.
See the change. But so as I say, where my lifestyle changed dramatically, I kind of adapted to suit that.
Okay.
So initially everything was purely around gut health and immune support.
Right.
Which initially was to benefit the treatment.
Right.
Or rather to benefit my body during treatment.
Right.
But now, as my life has changed, and it has dramatically, I've got a completely different perspective and outlook on everything now. God willing. It's, I'm truly blessed to be where I am today. My diet kind of revolves around that, my activity and what I do on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so hold on there for a second, because what you just said was actually really interesting and poignant. So you said my diet revolves around what I do day to day on a daily basis. And actually, I would argue that vice versa is also true. What you do on a day-to-day basis revolves around what your diet is, what's in your diet, because obviously our mind is connected to our gut and our vice versa. And so actually what we are, what we eat, the old dictum,
true, yeah.
and it impacts how we think, how we act, our day-to-day capacity, capabilities, etc. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, because I thought that you just captivated me as you were saying that. So sorry, go back to what you were saying, but had to add that in there.
Yeah, no. So as I say, so obviously we went strict vegan, which served the purpose. It, as we touched on, body into shock, and I think that was kind of the turning point for me. Apart from the fact that I obviously built the foundation within to fight or help my body fight the effects of the drug from a negative aspect. So as I say, that it did its job. But as we've rightly touched on, too much of a good thing can arguably be a bad thing. There's, what we said about fibre, etc. So now what I have now is more balanced, but I'm quite particular about some of the vegetables that I have. Okay. I look on a mineral basis on certain things. So, for example, I have a lot of wakame now, which is basically dry seaweed.
Okay.
Which has got pretty much every mineral in it that we need.
Okay.
I've changed the
And
sorts.
Is that in tablet form or is that in pure form?
No, that's in pure form.
So you eat seaweed, okay.
With.
And do you source it from anywhere particular?
There's actually a place called you can get it from most places, to be fair.
Okay.
But there's a place called the Japan Center, which is where I go to. Yeah.
Nice.
It's,
okay.
Which is great. And in fact, I get I also have I get miso from there as well.
Nice. Okay.
Which is like a fermented soybean paste, which is full of prebiotics, which is brilliant stuff. So my mindset is still within the boundaries of what's good for my system. But the difference is I've just kind of escalated it a little bit, or made a slight sidestep.
Right.
So still putting all that goodness back in, but from a slightly different dynamic. So whereas before it was all purely plant based, now I'm having some. I don't go buy my fish or anything from the supermarket. I go to the local store with I live in Essex, and all the fish is caught. We're right on the coast.
Yeah.
All the fish is caught there.
Yes.
And so everything is again as fresh and organic as it pretty much can be.
Right.
And I pretty much live off that. That's my daily meal.
Yeah.
Is whether it so in the morning I have smoked salmon. I have organic, farm fresh. They still have the feathers on them. And it's still warm sometimes when I pick them up.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, they're that fresh. Yeah, yeah. I thought they'd be impressed.
You mean the eggs, not the chicken?
The egg.
Okay.
No,
I thought you meant the chicken that arrives to your door.
The egg.
God, you suddenly had me picturing live chicken floating around in your house.
So salmon and eggs, and I cook everything in the butter. But real, natural, organic,
none
pure
of this margarine
butter,
stuff.
not
margarine.
horrible processed.
Yeah, not fake
so-called
oils.
butters.
Yeah,
exactly. Still well away from those now.
Yes.
I mean, that's another, to be fair, backtrack here. But it was when I started to do some further research on what seed oils can do.
Awful.
Again, which
and they've been proposed or promoted as being healthy. I mean, all this rapeseed oil and palm oil. Ugh, it's awful.
I mean, what is rapeseed oil? Rapeseed is generally used for they stop.
It's from a flower, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, that's what the yellow fields that we see.
Yeah, the UK grows copious amounts of it, and then palm oil comes from Africa, and
that's right.
Terrible plantation. Yeah, grown and very
But they've stopped because they used to feed it to cattle as well, and they don't anymore because of the side effects. Wow. So what does that tell you?
Yeah, well,
so,
a lot.
So cut all the oils out, which is why I now cook with butter. I mean, and there's, again, I don't want to go off the tangent here, but there's the argument about cholesterol.
Yeah.
Which again, doing my own due diligence, and I suggest that people go out there, but the connections of cholesterol with heart disease, again, I think that's more related to trans fats.
Yes.
And whatnot, as opposed to the fats that we get within the meats and within organic meats and butters.
In good quality,
in good quality, exactly.
I think it happens when we started doing overly processed stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, just to recap, as I say, you asked about the diet. So I'll have scrambled eggs, 3 scrambled eggs with I put Celtic salt in there now, or Himalayan salt.
Yes.
I have, again, all the salmon that I get comes from the fish stall. It's all it's locally sourced, locally caught. I put any farm fish or anything like that. Stay way away
No
from all of that.
Absolutely.
Nothing farmed.
Yeah. No aquaculture.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's pretty much breakfast. I don't have a lunch as such. Then for main meal, I'll have sort of egg noodles with more fish. I have the wakame. Most of the stuff I cook in the wok. With some organic from the Japan Center, a little bit of soy sauce.
Nice. You're making me hungry.
So and that's predominantly my diet.
Amazing.
At the moment.
Yeah.
But I'm constantly keeping check on other bits. I mean, obviously I've got my supplement range that I take.
Right.
And there's other minerals and stuff that I take. We'll go into the supplements as we've already
separately,
touched on.
Yeah, but it's an important part
But
because as you've mentioned in another episode, but I think it's worth just highlighting very briefly here, is that there are many elements or food items or groups that we cannot realistically get on a daily basis because depending on where you live, you just can't access them. So, of course, having those elements like turmeric and all sorts of herbs and vitamins and minerals that come in food, having them in food form is ideal.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Because
I was gonna say,
getting them directly from the food
Yeah.
is ideal. However, there are some things like, what's the one? Acai, like the antioxidants from acai, or there was ashwagandha. You just can't get here.
You can't get that.
You know,
and the root extract, shilajit is another one.
Exactly.
Yeah, sea moss. It's you're not going to go and farm that yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So you do have to, get a little creative, so therefore getting that in supplement form could be a good alternative. However, you have to be very careful that you don't get synthetic supplements, that you get food-based supplements.
101%
which
do your
is
homework.
A significant difference.
100%.
And it makes a difference between, excuse the term, but peeing it out versus absorbing it.
Yeah. And absorption's a key thing.
Absorption is the key.
You have to understand.
Speaking of turmeric, as we talked about.
Black pepper.
Why?
Yeah, because your body won't absorb it without the black pepper.
Right, exactly.
So, and cayenne pepper is another one.
Yes.
And apple cider vinegar.
Yes.
Is another one, which I take daily as well. Again, I take that as a supplement, but I've also got that bottled as well.
Yeah.
So.
And again, apple cider vinegar, you don't just want any apple cider vinegar off the shelf. You want the organic one with the mother in the bottom. That little weird sediment looking stuff that's at the bottom. That's the good stuff.
That's what you want.
That's the best part.
Yeah.
People usually avoid that bottle. Oh, that looks gross. That looks off. No, that's the stuff that's good.
Yeah.
That's what you want.
And again, going into that, we're moving on to fermented foods.
Yes.
Massive.
Kimchi.
Massive advocate of that. Kimchi, I love.
Yeah.
It's such good.
Fermented
fermented cabbage and other foods as well.
Very good probiotic as well.
Brilliant probiotic.
Yeah, exactly.
So that as an alternative meal, I might have the miso soup.
Yeah.
So easy. You just took a teaspoon into. You mustn't boil it,
right?
Because it just kills the good bacteria.
Okay.
And the microbes in there. So you have the miso with the wakame, and that's why who are the longest? Who've got the best
health,
longevity on the planet?
Asians. Well, specifically Japanese. And, exactly.
Yeah. And I would say that at the moment, I have pretty much a
Japanese diet.
A Japanese diet.
Amazing.
Yeah.
My best friend from Italy, who's Japanese, half Japanese, would be very proud to hear that. Wonderful. She's always been advocating for that kind of diet.
But I guess just to quickly close on, from my end anyway, is organic, balanced.
Yes.
A good mixture of all organic and balanced, meats and vegetables.
Yes.
Are where you want to be.
Yes. Wonderful. Okay. Well, in subsequent, since we didn't have time today, but it's also a very important topic, we'll go more in depth about supplements and whatnot in a subsequent episode. But for all intents and purposes, we really want people to take away that diet is a crucial part to both preventing, healing from, and for post-recovery from cancer. Focus on the gut microbiome. That is essential. There's a lot more information out today than there was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There are a lot of controversial areas that we've touched upon. Some is whether soy is good for you, whether sugar is good or bad. But this essential thing is that you're getting it in its original food form, not in a processed form, and that you're trying to eliminate as much, if not entirely, if you can't do it entirely, eliminate as much of the sugar and processed foods and seed oils and all that as you can, and stick to an organic diet. It actually can be cheaper, even though it seems more expensive on the surface, because you end up eating less, even though you're spending a little bit more, and those extra few pennies in the short term are an investment in your health.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you soon.
Hopefully so.